Welcome, everybody. You know, you're seeing the
entire screen. You don't have the slideshow set up. You didn't turn on the slideshow. Resume slideshow.
Shoot. I'm not getting it. Okay.
There you go. Now you got it.
Okay. So yes, this is Ronald Grimm. I'm the Vice President and Program Chair of the Washington Map Society, and probably one of the least technically advanced in the society. But I'm filling in tonight for Jeff Katz, the President of the Map Society. He is traveling. I think he's somewhere in the Indian Ocean today. So we send him our greetings. And welcome tonight to everyone who's attending. I saw at least 60 people had signed in. I see new faces and I see a lot of familiar faces. Tonight's program was organized in cooperation with the Library of Congress Philip Lee Phillips Society, and it's sponsored virtually by a partnership of 7 map societies representing all parts of the country: California, Chicago, New York, Philip Lee Phillips, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and Washington map societies. These map societies are nonprofit organizations that support collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. These groups also supply financial support for this Zoom meeting. If you are not a member of any one of the groups, we would ask you to consider joining at least one. Benefits vary for each society. As you've heard numerous times, members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portal and Journal, digital access to all past issues, digital access to past guest speaker lectures, and many other features in the members-only website portion of the website. If you're not a member of the Washington Map Society, we have an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of digital membership. We and our partner map societies would like to thank our advertisers who support our groups and also help make possible the publication of our journals, the Portalin and the Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. Before we proceed further with tonight's program, here are several requests for the Zoom participants. Please note that the lecture will be recorded, so please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. Please use the chat feature to type questions, and they will be addressed at the conclusion of the talk. In consultation with the other map societies, we have developed a schedule of monthly Zoom and in-person meetings through June 2023, and we are working on the schedule for the fall. The current schedule was listed in the most recent issue of the Portalin and has been circulated to the program chairs of the other map societies. The next combined Map Society Zoom meeting is scheduled for a month from now, Thursday, March 16, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. It will feature George Barros, Geospatial Intelligence Team Lead and Russia Analyst for the Institute for the Study of War here in Washington, D.C. The title of his presentation is Open Source Maps, Mapping the Russian Invasion of Ukraine. This timely briefing will focus on the Institute's open source methodology as their team collects, processes, and analyzes and interprets data that supports their maps and written prose assessments. The brief will also present analytical decisions that ISW has made on how they structure maps, what they show and do not show, how they do source characterization, caveat confidence levels, and leverage remote sensing technology. Now, departing from my normal routine of just introducing the speakers, I would like to take a moment to make a special announcement, bringing to everybody's attention a recent decision made by the board of the Washington Map Society. Several months ago, Leah Thomas, the current editor of the Portalan, informed us of her desire to step down as editor following the publication of the forthcoming spring 2023 issue. The board sincerely thanks Leah for her efforts in guiding these editorial efforts during the pandemic, which has been an unusually difficult time. After several months of searching, the board has selected a new editor. Tonight, we would like to publicly welcome and introduce the new editor of the Portalan, John Hessler. Besides being tonight's presenter, he has enthusiastically stepped forward to guide our journal during the next phase of its development. Thank you, John, for volunteering for this position, which is an activity that has become a crucial part of the Washington Map Society's outreach. Now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speakers. First, as already mentioned, John Hessler, who recently retired from the Geography Map Division Library of Congress and is now lecturing part-time at Johns Hopkins University, among other things. And two recent Library of Congress GIS Research Fellows, Catherine Discenza, University of Florida, and Anika Fenn, Gilman, Tulane University. And I understand I have left and right wrong. So I will get to meet them in a few minutes. The title of their talk, which is very appropriate for February as Black History Month, is The Mapping of Race in America, the Legacy of Slavery and Redlining from 1860 to the present. John and his colleagues will address a few of your questions at the conclusion of the presentation. If you have questions, please add them in the chat feature during or at the conclusion of their presentation. And now I turn the program over to John, Catherine, and Anika.
Thank you, Ron. When you stop sharing, I will continue. All right. So everyone, I want everyone can see that, I assume. I want to thank everyone for coming. We have a nice group tonight. It looks like we have more than 80 people, which is nice for Zoom on a night like this. I'm going to begin by giving the introduction to this, and then at some point I'm going to turn it over to both Catherine and Anika to talk about some of the more modern work we've been doing with these maps. This was all part of their project. They were junior fellows at the Library of Congress, but it was inspired by a much deeper project that I was working on for several years. Most of the inspiration for this project came from my work with the House Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. And the House Select Committee on Fairness and Growth was part of the last Congress. It was chaired by Representative Jim Himes of Connecticut. It was a bipartisan committee, which worked very, very closely together in order to kind of look at the history of economic disparity and disparities in fairness and growth around the country. The project itself, when I first met with Representative Himes and some of the other members on the committee, Representative Himes had on his desk a large stack of papers, which were several thousand pages. And he said to me, What you're looking at here is the report from the House Select Committee on Climate Change. And he said, although there's a great deal of work that has been done on this thing, no one is going to read the 3,450 pages of this report. So what I want to do is I want to come up with a way to actually visualize our work where people would actually look at it, and people in the country who this is important to will actually get something out of it. And so we began working on several different map applications. It turned out into something that we're not going to talk about tonight, but it turned out to a very complex GIS that was created for the House Select Committee, which is publicly available, which basically mapped all of the interviews they did, mapped all of the areas where they found economic disparity and the people who talked about fairness and growth. This was a committee that traveled around the country a great deal and interviewed lots and lots of people. And we created this web app, both myself and some engineers from ESRI, who are the big, of course, GIS software company, created this web mapping application so people could go in, look at the areas where they're from, see the interviews of people who were both positively affected by economic growth and negatively affected. And they were really looking for kind of the roots of this. The committee also, for the first time, produced a documentary film, which is also available publicly, which is narrated by Sarah Jessica Parker of Sex and the City fame. And so this committee did a great deal of work looking at historical trends in economic disparity, historical trends in fairness and growth, really trying to root out some of the trends that historically came from the deep past and that had kind of kept going into the modern era. So this project, when I started working with the House Select Committee, I kept banging up against a series of maps, most of which were in the 19th century or the early 20th century, which was mapping of race in America. And so we're going to talk about that in a bit, what that actually means, and broadly conceive the mapping of race. What does that actually mean when we're talking about the mapping of race? So I thought this would be an ideal project for the junior fellows, for the GIS Research Fellows. And Anika and Catherine were selected out of almost 80 people who applied for the position to actually work on this project. We didn't have a great deal of in-person work because it was during, of course, the pandemic, and the library was still keeping their fellows off-site. So we had to work remotely, very much like we're doing here. This project has continued since they've gone, and currently we have a database that's been put together of nearly 700 maps, which map race during the period that we're interested in, which is about 1862. Really, we're going to kind of cut it off at redlining, and both Anika and Catherine will talk about their work on the redlining maps after I kind of get through some of the historical material. Now, everyone in this audience, at least for the most part, probably knows of this map. This is one of the most famous maps of mapping race. It's from 1860. It was published in 1861, but it's from the 1860 census. And it is a map of the slaveholding populations across the southern United States. It's an extremely famous map. It's been talked about a great deal, but it has some shocking things associated with it. If you look closely at this map and you begin to analyze some of the data in it, and we're going to get to some data analysis in just a bit about what we mean by using sort of modern GIS to kind of analyze or visualize some of this data. And what we're going to find is there's so much data. There is such rich demographic information about the mapping of race that is ephemeral, that it has not been used in any effective way by scholars for the most part. I would venture a guess that a full half to 3/4 of the 700 maps that have been identified as the mapping of race during this period are completely unknown to scholars. They come from ephemeral publications. They come from NAACP pamphlets. They come from the pamphlets of the Black Panthers. all of which haven't been given credit for the cartographic radicalism and the use of cartography as a radical tool. And we're going to see one of the questions that the fellows and I asked is really three. Really, what does racial mapping look like in the history of the United States? That's the first question. The second question is who is doing it? And the third question is what were they using it for? Why was there so much racial mapping being done? What was the purpose of these maps, both politically, demographically, and really to serve a political ideal or to convince people of something? Obviously, cartography is a visual medium. It is a medium that abstracts from the real complex realities of the world and presents really complex issues in a way that a lot of people can understand geospatially. And that is the power of cartography. And we're going to see the kind of historical beginnings of the mapping of race being used as a tool for radical change. And we're also going to, when we get to Anika and Catherine's presentation, show how cartography can also use to institutionalize systematic racism. And so we're going to see this idea of racial mapping and the mapping of race has this broad function across time periods. When we take a look at this map closely, one of the things that you find is the percentage of the population that's mapped in each county. And it's somewhat amazing and somewhat unknown to most people, I would imagine, that there are counties in the South that had more than 90% of their population were enslaved peoples. It's a map that shows the sort of incredible distribution of enslaved Africans across the country in 1860. And we're going to come back to this idea of the census of the enslaved in a little bit. I just wanted to show this map because it's one of the ones that people talk about and see all the time. What I'm showing now, the PowerPoint or the presentation I'm showing is actually the web mapping application that myself and the two GIS fellows built. This is available online. It's on ESRI's gallery site. It's been nominated for several awards, which will be coming up in the next couple of weeks as a resource. So you can get the link and I'll put it in the chat when we're finished and anyone can download, read it, and do whatever you'd like with it. So when we talk about the mapping of race, I'm going to begin really with the sort of the historical beginnings of the NAACP. And the NAACP, through several people whose names are sort of household names in the early part of the civil rights movement, people like Ida B. Wells, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, used cartography in order to do really two things. First, in the sense of Ida B. Wells, she wrote a book called The Red Record, which was a catalog of lynchings in the United States from 1892 to 1893 and 1894. And just a bit of a warning here, we are going to be talking about things that are unpleasant and are somewhat shocking as we move along. A lot of the records we're going to be talking about deal with this kind of thing. So just a warning for those who might be upset by this. We are going to be talking about this in somewhat graphic detail, especially as we move forward through the talk. So Ida B. Wells published this really important pamphlet. And you can see there it says, respectfully submitted to the 19th century civilization in the land of the free and the home of the brave, somewhat sarcastically. It's called The Red Record and it's lynchings in the United States. Now, what Ida B. Wells does here is basically make lists. She basically talks about the actual lynchings and the locations. And she was a journalist. She was a reporter who was enslaved until she was 16. She was emancipated and became editor of a newspaper called The Free Speech and Headlight, which was published out of the Beale Street Baptist Church in Memphis, Tennessee. But her real lasting claim to fame, as far as cartography goes, is really this book. And this book, she scoured newspapers from across the country and across the South to basically look for records of lynchings. And she cataloged them in this book. And what the two fellows did was the two fellows took this book, Anika and Catherine, and they took those records and they turned them into a database. So basically, who was lynched, why they were lynched, where they were from, what the date was, and what the place was. We turned that into a point map, and then we went a little bit further and turned it into an interactive heat map. So if you go onto the website later on, all of the maps I'm going to be showing for the most part that have been created by Catherine and Anika are interactive. So this is basically a heat map of the lynchings in the United States directly from Ida B. Wells's book. So there's a lot of this ephemeral geospatial data out there, which gives us a real idea of where things were happening, where concentrations of systematic racism took place. And there are literally, I'm only going to be talking about some of the more famous ones, but there are literally reams of this kind of data out there. Not only things like lynchings, but other things, ownership of farms, people who were not granted bank loans, all of that kind of information is available for the study and the systematic mapping of race in the United States. If you click on this map, what happens is it's going to bring up a little box, and it's going to tell you that this was William Brooks. He was lynched in Galesline, Arkansas on May 23rd, 1824 for asking a white woman to marry him. This particular area has a large concentration of these sort of lynchings, and we can see actually put names for the first time in a century or more to these people and to what happened to them, all out of this very rare and difficult to find book that was published by Ida B. Wells. Now, the NAACP did a lot of mapping, and part of that was through W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He went to Berlin and did graduate work, and he was the first African-American to earn a doctorate at Harvard. He worked at the US Census Bureau, and in 1904, he wrote an extremely important pamphlet called The Negro Farmer. This is a pamphlet that almost no one reads today and very few people know about. It is filled with statistics and numbers. It's also filled with maps. It's also filled with the most interesting maps that you can possibly think of at this time. In this sense, W.E.B. Du Bois, when he was working for the Census Bureau, and he did this, and this is an insert into the actual census report. It's actually inserted in there in the later census report. It's a 30-page pamphlet, which is filled with cartographic material. And W.E. Du Bois wasn't looking at the Negro farmer in a negative way. He was attempting in this pamphlet to show the actual strides that Africans and former enslaved peoples have made during the intervening years since emancipation. One of the ones that's very interesting, and so you can see here, this is a map of the southern counties in 1900, where at least 50% of all the farms are owned by former enslaved now citizens and African Americans. So you can see these distributions, and this is a very ephemeral type of mapping, but it's an important thing that W.E. Du Bois began thinking about this sort of information in terms of visualizing it cartographically. Now, W.E. Du Bois also was very instrumental in the 1900 Universal Exhibition. The Universal Exposition, he had basically contributed maps, which basically showed the migration of African Americans around the country. It also showed lots and lots of visual graphics, which were unique to W.E. Du Bois. These graphics are actually in the manuscript division of the Library of Congress. They haven't been talked about much, but he was extremely innovative in the way he displayed things like the land holdings and income. Most of it is cartographic in nature. It's geospatial in nature, picking out particular areas, showing particular types of things. mostly economic in this way. So W.E. Du Bois was really critical in beginning this work on these kinds of visualizations associated with race. He was very much influenced at this point by some of the French statistical work and some of the German statistical work. This is 1904, 1905, and then in the 1890s when he's working. And a lot of this material is taking its hold from both mapping and visualization of data, both in France and Germany at the time, where a lot of innovations in data visualization were taking place. The NAACP continued to use maps throughout their beginnings. They published a magazine called The Crisis, again, an ephemeral journal, and maps appeared basically to highlight any kind of important statistical information. In the February 1922 issue, Madeleine Allison, Du Bois' secretary at the NCAA, mapped 3,456 lynchings that took place over the past 32 years and put them on a map, which she called the dots of shame. One of the most interesting things about the maps in The Crisis, and there's a large number of them during this period, is all of the cartographers and all of the people who are making these maps are women, completely unknown women cartographers who are taking statistical data, taking the geographic and geospatial data, and actually then visualizing it on maps. And so it was an important way to visualize some of the things that were happening across the country and looking at the differences in the density of lynchings and the unfair treatment by the legal systems in various places across the country. One of the most important publications of the NAACP was a little bit earlier than that and took place in April 1819, which was called 30 Years of Lynching in the United States. This is a critical publication that in the early period drew attention to the horrors of these crimes that were being perpetrated against former enslaved people and African Americans, mostly in the South. Although, as you see, outside of a few states like Minnesota and Maine, most of the states still have lynchings taking place. But you can see the vast concentration of this sort of behavior takes place in the South, which was obviously the point of these maps. One of the things that was also important as far as racial mapping goes is really the earliest United States Census data. The census data is become very important in studying this. It really began, really the most readily accessible stuff was produced by the US Census Bureau really starting in about 1790. And it was released in these census atlases where we see a lot of different kinds of demographic data. This data has become available in a much more handy way for people who do GIS and people who want to do analysis at the National Historic GIS Project at the University of Minnesota, which is digitized and made available as databases, all of this early census data. Now, this early census data there were two ways that information came. There was the regular census, which was for normal people, white people in this case. And then there was something called Schedule 2. And Schedule 2 is extremely interesting reading if you go to the National Archives and you look at Schedule 2 documents from the early period. The way enslaved peoples are talked about in these documents are by the name of the slave owner and simply the number of how many people they own. And so there are pages and pages and pages of unknown peoples who are nameless, but who appear in the census data as part of the property of people. And so it's sort of a stark reminder of actually the way the census was conducted during these early periods before emancipation. A lot of early census maps do a whole different ways of visualizations. There's sort of experimenting. This is 1870, and we can look every decade as we move through past emancipation into the late 19th century and then into the 1900s. One can see if one is a a map lover, the sort of improvement in not only the engravings, but improvement in the actual data and also the way it's displayed. Again, there's a lot more in here that anyone who is interested can actually look at as we, if you look at the actual web mapping application. So the last thing we're going to talk about, and I'm going to turn it over to Catherine in just a minute, is redlining and the legacy of institutional cartographic racism. Catherine is going to explain some of the redlining work that they did, some of the comparisons they did with modern and modern demographic data and redlining. And what we're going to see here is we're going to see certainly a certain legacy. If you don't know what a redlining map is, redlining map was created after the Great Depression. The US government created something called the Homeowners Loan Corporation for the purpose of refinancing home mortgages. They assess the level of security of real estate investments across the United States. This is a gallery of them. I'm just showing one from Baltimore, which is where I'm sitting right now. Those who know anything about the distribution of African Americans in Baltimore, obviously the red is the worst areas and blue is and green are the best areas. These sort of maps created a legacy of basically disenfranchising certain particular areas of cities because of who lived there. There's a lot of manuals that were put together. This is an underwriting manual that was put together by the Federal Housing Administration. And basically, if you read some of these, you will be horrified by the language. Colored infiltration, a definitely adverse influence on neighborhood desirability, although Negroes will buy properties at fair prices and usually rent rooms. Italian infiltration depresses residential desirability in this area. Infiltrations of Jewish into the area have depressed values. This is a US government publication to guide the Federal Housing Administration and to guide real estate agents about how to class properties. And so redlining maps had a deep and profound impact on future economic development for certain groups of people in cities. And so I'm going to turn it over to Catherine at this point. I don't know, Catherine, are you going to share a screen, or do you want me to get out?
Yeah, I'll share my screen. I have a PowerPoint.
So, all right, I will stop share and you can.
All right. Yeah, unfortunately, my laptop won't load the web map properly while I'm also on Zoom. So you'll just have to bear with the traditional PowerPoint for now. But so much of my individual work on our story map focused on the case study of Tampa. I created a series of maps that quantitatively demonstrates the legacy impact of redlining in Tampa, looking especially at environmental health factors. I chose to look at Tampa because that's the city I grew up in, so I have a lot of local knowledge that helps me to contextualize, hopefully for you all as well, the geographical data displayed in these maps. In fact, you can actually see my high school that I attended on this map. It is this white rectangle up among these A and B graded neighborhoods. But notably, it's a Title I school because while it's amongst these small, very highly graded neighborhoods, today the population of that high school actually draws heavily from East Tampa, which you can see was heavily redlined and awarded D grades at the time of creation of the HOLC maps, and it remains that way today. So those East Tampa and West Tampa, which were heavily redlined here, you can see remain some of the poorest areas of the city with high minority populations. The best graded neighborhoods you see here, Davis Islands, Bay Shores right along here, and then you get Hyde Park and Palmacia down here. Those remain incredibly wealthy and white neighborhoods. Some of the neighborhoods that would have been rated poorly on the original redlining maps no longer even exist. The Scrub is one of these neighborhoods. It was a Black neighborhood and business district, referred to as the Harlem of the South. that was demolished in the 50s and 60s to make way for the I-4 interchange, just north of downtown and west of Ybor. It would have been right about this area here. And with all this local knowledge, I might move a little quickly when pointing out areas of interest. So I'll try and keep an eye on the chat if I can, and let me know if you need any clarification. The first map in this series is comparing redlining to modern urban heat health. So this data demonstrates an effect that if you've taken a look at the web app, you may have seen in the Baltimore case studies map of tree cover. So here previously, redline neighborhoods lack natural cooling factors, resulting in greater heat island effects. The highest graded neighborhoods in Tampa, as I mentioned, this Hyde Park Palmacia area in particular, but also this Northern Seminole Heights area near where my high school was. Those have the lowest percentage of impervious surfaces, while East and West Tampa, running right across here, have very high percentages of impervious surfaces, over 50%. So the effect of impervious surfaces is when you have a surface like asphalt, it'll absorb heat and retain it very well at much greater rates compared to vegetation. Impervious surfaces can also be related to other public health factors, as these areas with high percentages of impervious surfaces may also indicate a lack of green space that would benefit the physical and mental health of residents. I've also included a satellite image that I think really helps to drive home this point. You can see here that in the same A and B graded neighborhoods, even at this scale, you can see quite a bit of tree cover, whereas in West Tampa and again across through East Tampa, you see much less tree cover. So tree cover also helps to mitigate heat island effects. And heat islands result in higher daytime temperatures. They cool less effectively in the night than surrounding areas. They have poorer water quality and higher levels of air pollution. And all of these factors can contribute to heat-related and pollution-related illness. So with greater urban heat, people living in formerly redlined neighborhoods are more vulnerable to these health impacts. The next map I created as part of this case study overlays Superfund sites with HOLC redlining maps. So Superfund sites are designated by the EPA for cleanup due to extensive contamination by hazardous materials, frequently due to industrial processes. Maybe there was some sort of leak in an industrial site. Maybe they were improperly disposing of chemicals, but it contaminates the site and the EPA orders cleanup. And they either fund it themselves or if there are parties found responsible, they are instructed to fund the cleanup and the EPA oversees it. So as you can see, there are actually no Superfund sites in A and B graded neighborhoods in Tampa, and only 3 sites that are in C graded neighborhoods. All other Superfund sites in modern Tampa correspond to historically redlined districts. These health impacts of the sites can vary based on the extent of contamination and effectiveness of cleanup efforts. The most extreme examples you may have heard of are when cancer clusters are linked to Superfund sites. This happened in Wilbur, Massachusetts and Toms River, New Jersey. A lot of the time, though, the effects are less extreme. They may be a bit harder to link to specific Superfund sites, but it's still concerning that the vast majority of these sites within the old Tampa city limits are in formerly redlined neighborhoods. This tells us a lot about historical zoning practice priorities and who the government is comfortable exposing to the risk of industrial practices. The final map in the Tampa case study compares redlining to health insurance access. I've just brought up the original redlining map again so that you can get a bit of get the picture back in your head of it, where again, most of the A and B graded neighborhoods were down here towards the south of Tampa, and the D graded or redline neighborhoods are in East and West Tampa. So looking at this map, it shows us the percent of people who are uninsured. So the Bayshore, Palmacia, Hyde Park area down here are once again doing much better than the rest of the city. They have the lowest rates of uninsured people in those neighborhoods. And again, West Tampa, Ybor City, and East Tampa are all, the populations there have higher rates of being uninsured. Notably, there's a lot that this map doesn't show, looking at purely rates of who has insurance coverage. The American healthcare system routinely fails even those who do have insurance. So data on health insurance rates like this doesn't reflect those who are underinsured, those who cannot afford the costs associated with a medical emergency. It doesn't reflect people who've struggled to access in-network providers or actually attend appointments for whatever reason. Maybe they have trouble getting to an appointment physically, maybe they have trouble taking work off. And it doesn't affect those who struggle to navigate the insurance system. So people who may not have the knowledge, time, or energy to dispute insurance claims or really understand how to make the most of their coverage. So this map is a useful snapshot, but it doesn't have the whole picture of healthcare access. And then just to wrap this up, ultimately the legacy of redlining and more recent, less overtly racist policies are having an impact on the health of people who are already the most vulnerable. While this case study can offer only qualitative evidence, the potential for these impacts is certainly clear. We've very clearly seen in each case, the best rated neighborhoods continue to perform better on the health factors that we looked at today. People living in formerly redline neighborhoods who are still more likely to be poor and people of color compared to the rest of the Tampa population have higher rates of being uninsured and face greater exposure to environmental health threats. A and B grade neighborhoods, on the other hand, remain white, wealthy, and face less of this health risk. Fixing the problems will not be easy. The health of Americans is significantly influenced by their environment and their wealth, which are both in turn significantly influenced by systemic racism. And that's really what we were trying to get to, comparing these redlining maps to modern data. And even when we try to improve the environments and the health risks people may face because of their environment, gentrification is a threat that comes with investing in formerly redlined communities if it's not done properly. Investment needs to be made not just in the physical spaces of the community, but the people themselves. Greater support in social housing or universal basic income are good steps in the right direction to repairing centuries of harm caused to the Black community in the US. And reparations will help Black Americans acquire some of the wealth that they haven't been able to accrue since abolition, potentially reducing the segregation we see aggravated by redlining and making it an important aspect of progressing towards equity across the country, and especially when progressing towards health equity. Okay. And I think I may have missed a question in the chat here.
Well, we can pick it up at the end, Catherine. So,
all right. In that case, I will go ahead and stop sharing so that I can pass it off to Anika.
Yes. So Anika is going to talk about another case study. As you can see here, Catherine will be headed off to graduate school to study health disparities in the next, after she finishes her work at the University of Florida. Anika is at Tulane University, and Anika, you can take it away, and then I'll come back when Anika is finished and kind of wrap up a little bit and talk about how this played into the work of the House Select Committee and where we go from there. So Anika, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Catherine. That was really awesome and a very striking examination of Tampa. So my name is Anika, and I am in my final semester at Tulane University. I'm studying math, political science, and GIS. Throughout this project, Catherine and I were provided with opportunities to engage with a lot of historical geographic materials, as John showed, contextualize them, and also create our own interactive features to support the goals of this project. So let me pull up my screen. Second. All right. So I live in New Orleans, where Tulane is, one of the most culturally unique and impactful cities in the country. With a vibrant and complex history of colonialism, immigration, and slavery, the city's physical, governmental, and social structures are still informed by racism, discrimination, and inequality. Redlining, a practice that developed in the 1930s, was a joint venture by banking institutions and the government to identify what they deemed to be high-risk neighborhoods for mortgage loans. These hazardous neighborhoods were overwhelmingly home to ethnic minorities and low-income communities. The original language that the Homeowners Loan Corporation used, that John also showed in our story map, deemed these areas hazardous for their, quote, infiltration of inharmonious racial or nationality groups. The geographic products of this process were maps in which undesirable areas were marked as grade D for hazardous and symbolized in red. Thus, the practice came to be known as redlining. Services, most often credit and insurance, were withheld from these neighborhoods, and the lasting impacts of this de facto discrimination are evident across the country. Using New Orleans as my case study, I sought to compare historical redlining maps to the issues that are still present in the city today. So I have pulled up right now the original redlining map of New Orleans, in which you can see large swaths of the city colored red and just small areas up by the lake and in Uptown graded A. So my first map looked at flood risk, and hurricane season in the United States usually runs from June to November. As climate change and global warming increasingly affect natural disasters, the risk of more intense and higher numbers of hurricanes also increases. New Orleans, positioned along the Gulf Coast, is uniquely susceptible to flooding and storm surge during a hurricane. CoreLogic's 2022 hurricane report analyzed damage risk potential for homes along the Atlantic coast and ranked New Orleans as the fourth most at risk for single-family home storm surge damage. There are over 400,000 homes at risk in the city. I compared data for New Orleans on normalized flood risk against a historic redlining map. So I created this sliding feature where on the left we have the redlining map, and on the right we have flood risk, where darker blue symbolizes a higher percentage chance of flood damage. I was interested in seeing if the flood risk correlated with merely physical location, such as neighborhoods closer to levees or having a lower elevation, or if there was any sort of pattern with these historically hazardous redline neighborhoods. Like I said, in this map, darker blue symbolizes a higher flood risk. And we can see neighborhoods like New Orleans East, which is all of this blue over here. And then, oops, sorry, I need to figure out how to close this. The Treme, which is this blue part in here, and then the lower 9th ward, which is this dark blue part over here, are all colored blue on this map. They are also colored red and graded D on the redlining map, as you can see here. This is the 9th ward. New Orleans East is up here, so it's not included. And then the Treme is right in here. Half of the population of the lower 9th ward, which is a predominantly Black neighborhood, had not returned to New Orleans after Katrina by 2016 because they either didn't have the financial resources to rebuild the areas that were devastated, or the services that they needed were not being provided in their neighborhoods. 4 of the most heavily damaged neighborhoods after Katrina have over 75% Black population. The lack of appropriate infrastructure, ability to rebuild, and assistance from local and federal governments have contributed to these long-lasting flood effects. Although perhaps not a direct effect of the process of redlining, environmental racism and lasting legacies of the systems that contributed to redlining create a consistent, profound inequality of flood risk in New Orleans. TalkPoverty.org and 538 have both published articles linking the susceptibility of Black neighborhoods to flooding in New Orleans to the idea that the high ground of the city was all taken by wealthy and white populations to own homes. Visually, we can see undeniable patterns between these two maps of where the flood risk areas are and what neighborhoods were redlined. So next, I looked to compare median incomes across neighborhoods. In this map, purple designates lower incomes and green shows higher incomes. So we can see again large swaths of purple in the Treme and down into the lower 9th ward along with East New Orleans, while much of the green populations are concentrated along the lakefront and in Uptown. As a whole, New Orleans has a household median income of about $43,000, with about a quarter of the population living in poverty. 30% of African American families live in poverty, compared to just about 8% of white families. In neighborhoods colored red that were rated D, such as Mid-City right here and the lower 9th Ward, we can click on that and see that it's rated D. And then moving over to this map, if I click on the same area, we can see that the current household median income is $26,000, so quite below the citywide median of 43. Income discrepancies mirror racial population makeup in the city and display the long-lasting effects of redlining and other racist political and geographical measures. While gentrification is also an ongoing process in New Orleans affecting these metrics, there are several initiatives working on housing affordability. However, the increasing gap between wages and cost of living, the growth of the short-term rental market in a city known for its tourism, and zoning pushback continue to exacerbate the long-term effects of redlining, racial discrimination, and income segregation. So those were my 2 case studies, just looking at New Orleans and how these redlining geographical choices still affect the city today. And yeah, I will stop sharing. I do have to hop off right at 8, so I won't be able to stay for the whole time, but I will put my email in the chat as well in case anyone has any particular questions about my case studies. Thank you all.
Thanks, Anika. I'm going to share my screen again here just to go back to, can everyone see that? Yes? All right, so this was only a bit of what is actually contained in the actual web mapping application, which for some reason is not quite loading here. I'm going to just load it again. There's a lot of stuff in here. There's a lot of material. Neither Catherine nor Anika touched on some of the more in-depth environmental studies that is in here. They just basically touched on some of the broader themes. We can start talking about things like maximum temperature, which Catherine touched on. We could also talk about things like diesel particulates, which are mapped onto the redlining maps in the web mapping application. So there's a lot in here for anyone who wants to look. Some of the stuff is just taking a while to load. But this is just, like I said, a beginning. Really, it was inspired by the work with the House Select Committee on Economic Disparity. And really, it has not really been completely explored. And the answers to our questions that we had, what does the history of mapping of race look like in the US, who was doing it, who was using it, and what they were using it for, has kind of yet to be completely answered. There's a diverse group of people who are mapping race, from using it as a positive thing to using it as a negative thing. Redlining has been extensively studied, but now with modern GIS tools, just some of a little bit of what you saw there, we can really start to dig down into that data and look at the sort of things that the House Select Committee on Economic Disparity was interested in. I will leave you with the last map in the web mapping application, which was done in a publication called Field Notes by the radical geographer William Bunge. This is where commuters run over Black children on the points to downtown tract. He did a whole series of maps of Detroit that showed not only the racial disparity that was occurring or that was historic, but also things that were happening because people were speeding too fast through Black neighborhoods and things like that. So this is, again, an extremely ephemeral publication. There's only 3 of them that were done. It was done by a society called the Human Exploration of Our Planet Foundation. So again, not an easy thing to find, but definitely part of our database, their work. The last thing I will leave you with will be a link here. This is a web application that we did for the Select Committee on Economic Disparity and Fairness and Growth. Talks about the committee. It maps their visits across the United States. They began in Washington, D.C., and basically shows where all of their field hearings are. And then there are many maps, which basically, if this loads, hopefully, which basically shows the location of all the interviews and all the work that the committee did. And some of these stories are just amazing, not only overcoming these racial disparities, but some of the people, the honesty that they had about how their families struggled. And any one of these stories is just an amazing story, which the committee allowed us to display cartographically. Every one of these links back to a video. It has a bio of a person and basically their life stories. So each one of these is mapped to a video. And you can get to each of the videos by clicking on the map, and it brings up all of the stories of these people. And so that was really what we set out to do. As I said, this is just a first step in actually considering what the mapping of race in America is and who did it. But we thought it was a nice resource, and both Anika and Catherine did phenomenal work on this under sort of COVID conditions. So, but this is, like I said, freely available to anyone, and we'd be more than happy to take questions. And I'm just going to open up the chat and see what everyone has to say here. So I guess there is a question for, in the case of New Orleans, is there evidence that redlining is driven by racial consideration, or is it that geographically undesirable locations were less attractive to people with money and less attractive to lenders? Anika can take that question if you want.
Yeah, I actually just sent a link to an article in the chat that kind of talks about it. It seems like, you know, obviously there's a lot of nuance in this, but the general consensus is that by the time banks were willing to lend money to Black homeowners to invest in houses in neighborhoods, all of the high ground had already been taken by white homeowners who the banks were willing to lend to much earlier on.
Yeah, this is really one of the real legacies, not only of redlining, but of the post-World War I and Depression era, is the fact that there was a difference in loan policies for racial minorities and certain ethnic groups. So even if you had a good job and wanted to buy a house in a place, it was very difficult to actually get a loan. And this basically snowballed with the sort of institutionalization of redlining, thereby keeping people out. There's an amazing book that was written just a couple of years ago called The Color of Law, which is basically about redlining and about this institutionalization of not allowing loans to be granted to certain groups, not only African Americans and formerly enslaved peoples, but certain minority groups that had difficulties also. So another question, have you looked at other public health issues like air pollution, carbon particulates? Well, yes, as we saw, this is something, there's a couple of really interesting places that are doing a lot of this work. The RAND Corporation is one that has an environmental justice web application, which we used a lot of their data, which basically goes into extreme detail with this material. They use the redlining maps as their sort of jumping off point to show this historical kind of trends and how this isn't simply a case of accidental people picking the wrong place to live. Obviously, the places that are bulldozed for highways are right through the middle of a lot of these redline neighborhoods in cities like New York. If you look at New York's redlining maps, it becomes quite apparent. And so this sort of thing has this long history. And this was really the inspiration of this is really coming from the House Select Committee and their idea of what are the factors, what has got us to where we are right now, what are the historical engines to this. And really, it's not about individuals. And I mean, there's a lot of talk in the press right now about critical race theory. You know, critical race theory has this idea that there are institutional and legal barriers that are not individual racism, but these institutions that in fact are have been developed that maintain this sort of thing, and there's this long historical trajectory. And if we look at the practice of redlining, we're certainly into one of those things that was used for a long period of time, and had enough of effect on inner cities as to actually quell development among certain groups of people and not others. So there's a question, are there maps being made of gentrified areas in the country? I don't really know. That's a good question. Catherine, do you have any idea, or Anika?
I haven't seen anything like that. I wouldn't be surprised to find that there are maybe maps being created at a local level, at city level, but I don't, especially if you're looking beyond that, I am not aware of any like current projects that are trying to map gentrification maybe across the country.
Yeah, and part of the difficulty is what that definition is, what gentrification means. We can see in a lot of instances, you can see by looking at the redlining maps that certain areas that were originally redlined have become gentrified and now are higher income because of their location. They're down by the water, or the factories that were once there have all closed and been bulldozed down, and new condos are being made. You can see that in some of the Brooklyn neighborhoods like Williamsburg, for example, in New York, which is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in New York City at the moment, was once redlined simply because it had tons of factories, and most of the people who lived there were either Jewish or Italian immigrants, which downgraded the area. There are certainly cases like this which can be definitely picked out on the redlining studies.
Can we ask questions?
Oh yeah, sure.
Well, this is fantastic work, and thanks so much for doing it in such clarity. There have been groups of people working on gentrification and racial discrimination, particularly in housing, but also in public health, for a few decades. And it might be interesting for you going on in graduate school to tap into some of this literature, because a lot of it dovetails with what you've done already, and you could extend it in very powerful ways. One of the things that's happened in the real estate industry is that they have a monthly, if not even a weekly, report on the difference between housing ask prices and housing closing prices. And they can tell instantaneously, almost within week to week, whether things are selling for higher than their asking price or lower than their asking price. And that's a study of trend. That's a self-reinforcing trend. That means you don't need to draw lines anymore in redlining. All you need to know as an insurance company is whether as a realtor, is to know whether your property, which you're trying to sell, is falling in an area which is of increasing value, that people are willing to pay more than the price that was asked for, or declining value, less than the price that was asked for. So that instantaneously you can get maps as a realtor to see whether you should be pushing this property or not.
Yeah,
And
one of the best
the redlining that goes on now.
Yeah, one of the best sources for that kind of information, which we looked at briefly and haven't put in the web app, is computer ownership. Computer ownership is another way to really define a neighborhood. How many internet access, how many broadbands, even if you put broadband into a neighborhood, what sort of broadband access there is. There's a ton of data out there. The project here really was trying to kind of concentrate on the purely cartographic aspects of this. So we limited it ourselves to the sort of visualization of race broadly conceived. Obviously, the redlining was one small part of this that the two GIS fellows worked on, simply because they wanted to get some experience with modern mapping and taking things like the US Census data and the American Community Survey and trying to overlay it with redlining maps in a way that was precise. So there's tons of studies, lots of people have put them in the chat, and you know, obviously we couldn't touch on everything, but we've at least the resource that we've made is more of a first shot at people who are interested in the mapping of race. And so, like as we say in our conclusions, this is just a beginning. If there are any more questions, we would be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can.
John, this is Rick Sayre. Could you comment on the work that the Digital Scholarship Lab is doing at the University of Richmond and how it relates to this work?
Yeah, the Digital Scholarship Lab is doing amazing work. The geo-rectified maps that we took of redlining come directly from the Digital Scholarship Lab. Their mapping inequality application is an amazing application. What it does is it basically allows us to do what we do. They've taken those original redlining maps, so the maps that, let's see here, let me go back to the maps that look like this, and basically they've cleaned them up and allowed us to be able to do these kind of overlays that we've been showing, because they've geo-rectified them in a very important way. They're doing amazing work. So basically what you see here, this is for Baltimore, for example, you see on this side, these cleaned up maps that both Catherine and Anika work with. These are from the Digital Scholarship Lab, and some of the data from the environmental environmental racism project. And so this is demographic data showing what the demographics of these particular areas are in Baltimore. So in the web app, there's a Baltimore study, and there is the Tampa and the New Orleans. One of the things we didn't talk about is really kind of the sort of original descriptions that come with these maps. So for instance, here are two neighborhoods in Baltimore. So some of the people who are living in the Carrollton or living up in Guilford here, and then downtown, some of the original descriptions. So the neighborhood that I'm sitting in is very nicely planned residential area of medium to large homes. Direct transportation to the center of city is good. Close to business area on Greenmont Avenue. Detrimental influences, none. But then if you look at the other one, you see that the type of people who live there are laborers. The favorable influence or proximity to employment, industrial and commercial, but a heavy concentration of foreigners, and property is in a very bad state of repair, which is the detrimental. So you can see the two sort of narrative descriptions that are taking place here. So let's see, we've got a couple more things in the chat here.
One more thing, they also have some follow-on applications such as urban renewal and so forth at DSL that seem to relate to the same theme.
Yeah, there's a number of people doing it. You know, especially when we get up to the redlining area, say, you know, post-World War I, post-Depression area into the Second World War, into the 50s and 60s. There's a lot of people working on both the collapse and then the sort of renewal of the inner city during that period of time. Again, like I said, we took a longer trajectory. When you do go into this web mapping application, you're going to see a lot of stuff here that we didn't talk about, and so a lot of material that kind of brings it all home. So any other questions?
John and Anika, and I'd like to thank you for your presentation. I think this was a extremely interesting combination of 19th century maps and 21st century technology. And for Anika and Constanza, I have two sets of note cards. They're not redlining maps, but they're artistic maps. And if, John, if you can send me their emails and their addresses, I'll forward them to them.
No problem.
And I think we've gone fairly long. I think it'd probably be good if we bring the meeting to a close. And I'm sure if you have pressing questions, you can get in touch with John.
Yeah, and I will put the link to the story map in the chat right now. So if anyone wants to look at it, download it, play with it, do whatever you want with it, you can. So like I said, there's a lot of interactivity there, which we obviously in the time frame we could not get close to even working through.
John, the link is also in the invitation people received to sign up for the Zoom meeting. But it's in that invitation also. You can,
Right.
if you find it.
So everyone, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your time, and have a good evening.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Washington Map Society.
Thank you all. Thanks, John. Good day all.